Somewhere in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a man hitched his horse to a buggy this morning, drove down a road at 8 miles per hour, and arrived at the market where he sells produce that he grew without a tractor. In fields he plowed with horses. On land his family has farmed without electricity for 300 years. He was not doing it for you. He was not doing it for tourism, or for nostalgia, or because he couldn't afford a truck. He was doing it because he and his community made a deliberate decision, which they make and remake every generation, that the modern world has things in it they don't want. America has more of these places than most people realize. Streets and neighborhoods and communities where residents have looked at what the 20th and 21st centuries are offering. Electricity, automobiles, the internet, central heating, television, and said no. Not because they lack the option, because they prefer the life they have to the one being offered. This list covers 10 of them. By number 1, the community we end on has been saying no to the modern world since 1693. And the interesting question, the one this list keeps returning to, is not why they refuse. It is what they know about daily life that the rest of us have forgotten. This entry begins with an argument. Acorn Street is 9 feet wide. It was built in the 1820s as a service lane for the coachmen and domestic workers of Beacon Hill, the people who kept the wealthy households of Chestnut Street running, who needed to be close to the stables without being on the same street as the families they worked for. The cobblestones underfoot are original Belgian block, installed in 1828. They have been there for nearly 200 years. At some point in the 20th century, the city of Boston decided that Acorn Street's original cobblestones needed to be replaced. Asphalt would be more practical, more easily maintained, cheaper to repair after winter heave. The proposal made administrative sense. The residents said no. They said it again the next time the proposal came up, and the time after that, and every subsequent time it has been raised. The cobblestones are still there. This is the specific texture of how Acorn Street refuses modernization, not through religious conviction or communal ideology, but through the stubbornness of a residential community that has decided the street looks exactly right and does not need improvement. The iron boot scrapers bolted beside the front doors, installed in the 1820s so residents could clean mud off their shoes before entering, are still there. The gas lamp fixtures retain their original cast iron forms, converted to electricity, but otherwise unchanged. The basement-level kitchen windows, designed for a domestic service economy that no longer exists, still look out onto the cobblestones from below street level. The houses on Acorn Street are among the most expensive residential properties per square foot in Boston. The people who live in them are not refusing modernity out of poverty or ignorance. They are refusing specific modern intrusions, primarily asphalt, and anything else that would alter the visual character of a street they chose to live on, precisely because it looks the way it looks. Every year, the city of Boston repaves streets across the entire metropolitan area. Acorn Street stays cobblestone. The residents have voted on this with their presence, their property values, and their repeated refusals to let anyone change what they moved on to. 9 feet wide, 200-year-old cobblestones, still there. In 1845, a group of 108 Swiss immigrants from the canton of Glaris arrived in Greene County, Wisconsin, on a land grant specifically arranged to give them somewhere to go. The canton of Glaris was overpopulated. The Swiss federal government funded the emigration. A commission selected the destination, rolling hills with a topography and climate similar enough to Switzerland that the emigrants might actually know how to farm there. They arrived, looked at the land, and named it New Glaris. They have been speaking German there ever since. New Glaris, Wisconsin, a town of approximately 2,200 people, has maintained a level of cultural continuity with its Swiss founding that is unusual even among America's ethnic settlements. The main street of the village looks like an alpine town, not because it has been themed or reconstructed for tourism, but because the buildings reflect an architectural tradition that the original settlers brought with them and that subsequent generations maintained. Swiss chalet styling, decorated facades, flower boxes, not as affectation, but as the natural expression of a community that has never stopped thinking of itself as Swiss. The new Glaris Brewing Company, founded in 1993, produces Wisconsin Belgian Red, a beer made with Door County cherries that has won international competitions and is sold exclusively within the state of Wisconsin. The owners have been offered distribution contracts that would make the beer available nationally. They have declined. The beer stays in Wisconsin, available only to people who come to Wisconsin to get it. This is a particular kind of refusal, not of the modern world exactly, but of the expansion that the modern world keeps offering. The brewing company doesn't need to be bigger. New Glaris doesn't need to grow. The Swiss heritage is maintained not as a performance, but as a living preference. The Wilhelm Tell Outdoor Theater Festival has been performed in New Glaris every Labor Day weekend since 1938, first in German only, then in both German and English, as successive generations became more English dominant. The story being told is of Swiss independence, of a people who refused to bow to a foreign authority. The community performing it has been here for 181 years, and they are still telling the same story. This entry is about a street that refused to become what everyone expected it to become. The Prom, the beachfront promenade at Seaside, Oregon, is a concrete walkway that stretches along the Pacific Ocean for 1.5 miles. It was built in 1920. The houses that face it from the inland side date mostly from the 1890s through the 1920s. Victorian and craftsman beach cottages, clapboard siding, covered porches facing the ocean, the kind of American seaside architecture that was being built everywhere on both coasts at the turn of the century. Almost all of it has been replaced everywhere else. Seaside kept most of it. The reason is not a preservation ordinance or a historical designation, though those came later. The reason is that Seaside's original development pattern, narrow lots, small houses, a community organized around walking to the beach rather than driving to it, proved resistant to the kind of tear-down and replace development that happened to similar beach towns from Malibu to the Jersey Shore. The lots were too small for the large modern beach houses that replaced the originals elsewhere. The economics didn't work, and the people who lived in the original cottages liked them, and kept them, and passed them to their children, who liked them too. Walk the side streets that run perpendicular to the Prom, Avenue A, Avenue B, Broadway, and you find what Seaside America looked like before it discovered that the original houses could be sold to developers and replaced with 3-story vacation rental units. The covered porches are still there. The clapboard siding is still there. The proportions, human-scaled, designed for a family on a summer holiday, rather than for maximum rental yield, are still there. The Seaside Aquarium, opened in 1937, is still family-owned and still operating on the Prom. The carousel at the end of Broadway has been spinning since 1921. The 1920 promenade is still the original concrete. Seaside did not decide to be historic. It decided to stay small. The smallness preserved it. Marblehead is a fishing town on a rocky peninsula north of Boston that was founded in 1629, and that appears, from its water-facing side, to have changed very little since approximately 1750. The streets of Old Marblehead, Washington Street, State Street, the lanes running down to the harbor, are narrow enough that 2 cars cannot pass each other in opposite directions. They are narrow because they were laid out for foot traffic and horses by a fishing community that had no reason to think about automobiles because automobiles were 300 years away. The houses pressing close to the street on both sides are colonial and federal-era structures, some of them original to the 17th century, others from the 18th. The narrowness is not a preservation strategy. It is an accident of initial geography and a fishing economy that never had quite enough prosperity to tear things down and build bigger. Marblehead was a major port in the colonial period. It supplied more men and ships to the Continental Navy than any other port in Massachusetts. But the 19th century's industrial prosperity passed it by, and the 20th century's urban renewal programs found little to work with on streets that were already too narrow for the equipment. So the houses stayed, and because they stayed, The people who came looking for a particular kind of waterfront community found it, and those people maintained what they found. There are 17th-century houses on Washington Street in Marblehead that are still occupied as single-family homes. The oldest, the Jeremiah Lee Mansion on Washington Street, built in 1768, is a Georgian house that is described by architectural historians as one of the finest pre-revolutionary houses in New England. Lee was a merchant who owned a large fleet of ships and spent what would now be millions of dollars on the construction and interior decoration of his home. He died in 1775, less than 2 months after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Some accounts say from a cold he caught hiding from British troops, and the house passed out of the Lee family. The Marblehead Museum now administers the Lee Mansion. The houses around it on Washington Street are still privately occupied. The street is still too narrow for 2 cars. Nobody fixed the streets, because fixing them would have required taking space from someone's house. Nobody took space from someone's house. The street stayed narrow. The narrowness is the preservation. Bird in Hand is a village in the heart of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, with a population of around 400 people and a name that has been explaining itself to visitors since the 18th century. The origin of the name is genuinely disputed. One version: 2 surveyors were debating whether to return to an inn called the White Swan in Lancaster or to camp for the night, and one of them said, "A bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush," meaning the inn at this particular crossroads, whatever its name, was better than the uncertainty of the road ahead. The inn took the phrase as its name. The village took the name from the inn. The village exists at the center of the largest Amish community in the world, and it occupies a position that most American towns don't. It is simultaneously a real community where people live and work, and a destination for people who come specifically to see how that community lives. The roads around Bird in Hand are shared between automobiles and horse-drawn buggies. The gray-topped Lancaster County Amish buggy, moving at 8 miles per hour on roads, with a posted speed limit of 45. The county has installed buggy lanes on many of the primary roads, shoulder strips marked specifically for slow-moving horse-drawn vehicles. The infrastructure of the 21st century has been modified to accommodate transportation technology from the 18th. Old Order Amish in Lancaster County. There are over 33,000 of them, in more than 200 church districts, do not use electricity in their homes. They do not own automobiles. They do not use tractors in their fields, instead using teams of horses to pull modern equipment. The decision about which technologies to permit and which to reject is made at the church district level, through a body of unwritten rules called the Ordnung. The Ordnung varies by district. Some allow solar panels for specific purposes. Some allow certain power tools. Some do not. What none of them allow is the automobile or electricity in the home, because these 2 technologies, more than any other, connect a household to the wider world in ways the community has decided it does not want. The Amish arrived in Lancaster County in the 1720s, fleeing religious persecution in Switzerland and the German principalities. They have been farming the same land, in essentially the same way, for 300 years. The farms they maintain are among the most productive in Pennsylvania, intensive, hand-worked, efficiently managed, generating agricultural output that most industrial farms cannot match per acre. The lanes around Bird in Hand smell of horse and turned earth in the morning. The buggies move through the same fields that were being farmed in 1720. The Ordnung is still unwritten. The electricity is still not there. Harper's Ferry sits at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, in a narrow gap in the Blue Ridge Mountains, at the border of West Virginia, and Maryland. It is one of the most dramatic natural settings for any town in the eastern United States. It is also the site of John Brown's raid. In October 1859, the abolitionist John Brown led a group of 21 men, 13 white, 8 black, in a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, intending to seize the weapons stored there and spark a slave uprising across the South. The raid lasted 36 hours. Brown was captured by a detachment of U.S. Marines commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee. He was tried for treason convicted, and hanged in December 1859. Brown's raid did not trigger the immediate uprising he intended. What it triggered was the final collapse of any political middle ground between North and South on the question of slavery. Within 16 months of the raid, the Civil War had started. Many historians consider Harper's Ferry the moment the war became inevitable. The town that witnessed all of this has been maintained by the National Park Service since 1944 as the Harper's Ferry National Historical Park. The lower town, the oldest section, closest to the rivers, contains 19th-century commercial and residential buildings that have been preserved in the condition they were in during Brown's time. The Armory Building, where Brown made his final stand, is gone, destroyed during the Civil War. But the streets around it, the stone commercial buildings, the church on the hill, these are intact. What makes Harper's Ferry unusual in the context of this list is what the Park Service actually did. Rather than restore the town to a specific historical moment, they preserved the accumulated layers of time. The buildings show evidence of multiple periods of use and occupancy. The Civil War damaged the town repeatedly. It changed hands between Union and Confederate forces 8 times. The floods, the rivers flood, regularly and catastrophically, and always have, repeatedly inundated the lower town. The people who live in Harper's Ferry today live in a town that has been partially managed as a national park for 80 years. The lower historic district looks like the 19th century because the Park Service has maintained it that way. The surrounding community lives alongside that managed past, in a town where you can walk from a building dating to 1782 to a coffee shop and back again in 5 minutes. Brown was hanged here. Lee commanded here. The rivers still flood. The streets are still stone. Grafton, Vermont has a population of approximately 650 people. It has a covered bridge, a white steepled church, a general store that has been operating since 1841, and a cheese company that has been making cheddar in the same style since 1892. It also has a private foundation that has spent 60 years preventing it from changing. The Wyndham Foundation was established in 1963 by Dean Matthey, a Princeton alumni and investment banker whose family had roots in Grafton, with the specific mission of preserving and restoring the town. The foundation purchased and restored the old tavern, now the Grafton Inn, operating since 1801, along with numerous other buildings throughout the village. It bought the cheese company. It bought the general store. It maintains the covered bridge and the roads and the aesthetic of a New England village that looks exactly as Vermont villages are supposed to look, because someone decided it should and put money behind the decision. This makes Grafton unusual and slightly uncomfortable in the context of a list about authentic preservation. The town's resistance to modernization is, in part, a philanthropic project. The Wyndham Foundation made deliberate choices about what Grafton would look like and then funded those choices for 6 decades. But here is the thing about Grafton. The people who live there, live there. They chose it over the modern alternatives. The 650 residents of Grafton woke up this morning in a Vermont village with no chain stores, no franchise restaurants, a general store that has been in operation for 183 years, and a cheese company that makes cheddar the same way it was made in 1892. The foundation made it possible to preserve those things. The residents made the choice to be there. The old tavern at Grafton, the Grafton Inn, has been providing lodging continuously since 1801. Ulysses Grant stayed there. Theodore Roosevelt stayed there. Rudyard Kipling wrote parts of the Jungle Books nearby. The cheese is still made in the same brick building. The general store is still selling the same categories of goods it sold in 1841. The covered bridge over Saxton's River is still the covered bridge over Saxton's River. Daufuskie Island sits between Hilton Head Island and Savannah, Georgia, accessible only by ferry. There are no bridges to Daufuskie. There is no regular automobile ferry. To get there, you take a passenger boat. The island's permanent population is approximately 500 people, down from a high of several thousand in the late 19th century, when cotton farming and oyster harvesting supported a substantial community of Gullah Geechee people, the descendants of enslaved Africans who developed a distinct culture language, and way of life on the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia after the Civil War. The Gullah Geechee culture that developed on Daufuskie and the surrounding islands is not a recreation or a performance. It is a living tradition that survived because the Sea Islands' geographic isolation, reachable only by water, distant from the mainland's social and economic pressures, created the conditions for cultural continuity. The language, a Creole with roots in West African languages, English, and elements of other enslaved populations' speech, is still spoken. The sweetgrass basket-weaving tradition, brought from West Africa by enslaved people and maintained across centuries, is still practiced. Pat Conroy, the author of The Great Santini and The Prince of Tides, taught school on Daufuskie Island in 1969, a year that became the basis for his first book, The Water is Wide. The book described an island community where the children he taught had almost no access to the mainland, where the Gullah language was the primary means of communication, and where the 20th century had made only partial contact. The island has changed since 1969. Parts of it have been developed as an upscale resort community. Hague Point, accessible by private ferry, maintains a golf course and private residences. The permanent community and the resort development exist on the same island without much interaction. What remains of the original Gullah Geechee community on Daufuskie is fragile and diminishing. The population has dropped steadily as younger generations leave for opportunities on the mainland. The elders who carry the language and the basket-weaving tradition are aging. The ferry schedules have not changed. The island's isolation, which preserved the culture for 150 years, now makes it harder for the remaining community to maintain it. But the culture is still there. The baskets are still being made. The language is still spoken by people who learned it from their grandparents, who learned it from theirs. The ferry is still the only way in. This is the entry that proves the rule by being the opposite of it. Lowell, Massachusetts, was built in the 1820s as the first planned industrial city in the United States. A city designed from scratch, on a greenfield site along the Merrimack River, to produce cotton textiles using water power from the river and labor from the young women of New England's farm families who came to work in the mills. The brick mill buildings, the canal system that powered them, the boarding houses where the mill girls lived, in company-supervised dormitories, all of it was constructed according to a plan. The streets of the mill district followed the canals. The canals followed the geography of the riverbank and the hydraulic requirements of the machinery. By the mid-20th century, Lowell's textile industry was gone. The mills had closed or moved south. The canals were stagnant. The boarding houses were occupied by the poor and the newly arrived. The brick mill buildings stood empty. In 1978, Lowell was designated a National Historical Park. An unusual designation, because the park is not a nature preserve or a battlefield, but an entire industrial city district, still occupied, still functioning as an urban neighborhood. What makes Lowell qualify for this list is what happened next. The residents who lived in the mill district and the adjacent neighborhoods did not leave. They stayed, and in staying, they maintained a relationship with buildings that most cities would have demolished. The brick mills, the weave rooms, the boarding houses, the counting rooms, that preserved an industrial landscape that is now the most complete surviving example of early American factory architecture in the country. The Boot Cotton Mills building still has 88 power looms running on the first floor, not for production, but for demonstration, maintained by the National Park Service as a working exhibit. The noise is extraordinary. The vibration is extraordinary. The smell of machine oil is in the air. The canal system that powered the mills still flows through the city. The boarding house row on French Street still houses people, not mill girls, but residents of a city that kept living in buildings its industry no longer needed. Lowell's residents didn't refuse the modern world. They couldn't, but they kept living in buildings the modern world had finished with, and in doing so, they preserved the evidence of what the modern world replaced. On the roads of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the speed limit is 45 miles per hour. The Amish travel at 8. The county has 200-plus church districts, each with its own ordnung, the body of unwritten community rules that governs what each household is and is not permitted to own, use, or do. The ordnung is not a written document. It is transmitted by community practice, by observation, by the decisions made in each church district's twice-yearly communion services. It is enforced not by any legal authority, but by the community itself, through social pressure, through the expectation of conformity, and ultimately, through the threat of Meidung, shunning, the complete social exclusion of a member who has broken too far from the community's ways. No electricity in the home, no automobile ownership, no tractor in the fields. These are not suggestions. They are the terms of belonging. The Amish arrived in Lancaster County in the early 1720s. Swiss and German Anabaptists who had been fleeing religious persecution across Europe for nearly a century. They were not seeking modernity. They were seeking land, community, and the freedom to live as their faith required. They found it in Pennsylvania. 300 years later, their descendants are still on the same land, farming it in essentially the same way. The fields are plowed with teams of horses, 4, 6, 8 horses, depending on the equipment and the task. The hay is cut with horse-drawn mowers. The harvest is brought in with horse-drawn equipment. The milk from the dairy farms goes to modern processing facilities, but it comes from cows milked in barns lit by propane or kerosene, on farms where the house has no connection to the electrical grid. The roads between these farms, Old Philadelphia Pike, Ronks Road, White Oak Road, the lanes running between the fields of Greene County and Leacock Township, carry buggies moving at the pace of the horse that pulls them. On a clear morning in Lancaster County, before the tourist traffic starts, you can drive these roads and see what American rural life looked like before internal combustion changed the pace of everything. The horse's breath in cold air, the sound of hooves on asphalt, the smell of hay and horse and turned earth. A family on the way to market, in a gray-topped buggy at 8 miles per hour. The Amish do not refuse modernity because they are afraid of it. They refuse specific elements of it because their community has decided, through a process of deliberate ongoing discernment, that those elements, primarily the automobile and the electrical grid, would connect individual households to the wider world in ways that would erode the community's coherence. They are not wrong. These are exactly the technologies that eroded the coherence of every other rural community in America over the course of the 20th century. The Amish community in Lancaster County has grown consistently for 300 years. The population doubles roughly every 20 years, driven by large families, and a retention rate, the percentage of young people who choose, after their period of Rumspringa, to return to the community and be baptized, of approximately 85%. 85% of Amish young people, given the choice between the modern world and their community's way of life, choose the community. The lanes of Lancaster County run through fields that have been farmed the same way for 3 centuries. The buggies are still moving at 8 miles per hour. The ordnung is still unwritten. The community is still growing. What they know that the rest of America has forgotten is probably not complicated. It is almost certainly something about the relationship between slowing down and staying together, about the difference between connection to a screen and connection to the people around you, about what is actually lost when you can go anywhere at 70 miles per hour and end up, somehow, farther from the people you started with. The horse goes 8 miles per hour. The community is still intact after 300 years. Draw your own conclusions. Every place on this list made a choice. Acorn Street chose its cobblestones over asphalt and has been choosing them, repeatedly, ever since. New Glaris chose to stay Swiss in Wisconsin for 181 years. The Amish of Lancaster County chose their ordnung over the electrical grid, made that choice every generation for 300 years, and are still making it. Daufuskie Island's Gullah Geechee community didn't choose isolation. It was imposed on them by geography and history and the specific aftermath of American slavery. But they made something inside that isolation, a language and a basket and a culture that is not available anywhere else. Harper's Ferry chose to be a place where history is legible, rather than buried. Grafton chose to be preserved, with philanthropic help. Lowell chose to stay in its mill buildings after the mills closed, which turned out to be its own kind of preservation. The common thread across all of them is not nostalgia. It is a decision about what matters, made explicitly, or accidentally, or through years of stubbornness, and then sustained. Most of the modern world is very good at offering new things. What it is less good at is being honest about what the new things cost. The places on this list are mostly very clear-eyed about that trade-off. The Amish are the clearest of all. They know exactly what they are refusing and exactly why. Whether the rest of us agree with their reasoning is beside the point. They have been making this choice and living with it since 1720. The horse is still moving at 8 miles per hour. Subscribe for more of the America that stayed. New videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.